A cold wind swept across the dusty trading post as evening shadows stretched long over the barren land. Wagons had already rolled out, merchants packed their goods, and most travelers hurried toward campfires or tavern doors. But she stood alone on the wooden platform, clutching a worn shawl, her boots trembling against the planks. She had not chosen to be there. She had not chosen to be traded like a stray horse, handed off to the highest bidder. Yet that was how her journey west had ended, not with hope or adventure, but with a bargain struck in whispers and silver coins. Folks around town spoke of frontier life shaping the strong, but no one mentioned what happened to the ones who had no say in shaping their own fate. She had been sold to a poor Apache farmer, a man whose land stretched across rocky soil near the canyon ridge. Most settlers only spoke of him in passing, calling him quiet, distant, a man who worked the earth with his own hands because no one else ever stayed long enough to help. He arrived at the depot quietly, leading a lean horse wrapped in a dark poncho, his expression unreadable. He did not look like the cruel type, nor did he seem eager to claim ownership over another human being. But coins still traded hands, and she was guided toward him with eyes lowered, heart beating wildly against her ribs. The cold truth of being sold settled deep in her chest, a truth she could not fight. He didn't drag her or speak harshly. Instead, he nodded once, almost like he was acknowledging not a purchase, but a burden placed in his care. Still, she kept her distance, walking behind him on the long trail home. The journey took hours, winding through tall pines and rugged desert grass. Coyotes sang in the distance, and the moon rose slow and heavy above them. Every step reminded her she was no longer her own person. She wondered what kind of man accepted a wife this way. Rumors ran wild about native warriors stealing brides or claiming women as trophies of war, but this man seemed nothing like those tales. His silence made her more uneasy than any threat. By the time they reached his homestead, the sky was black and stars burned sharp overhead. The house was small and simple, built from rough logs with a single lantern glowing inside. Corn stalks rustled behind the barn, and a few goats huddled near a fence. It wasn't a place of wealth, nor a place built for royalty. It was a place shaped by survival. She wondered if this humble land was all he wanted from life, and whether she was expected to simply fit into it. He opened the door for her, then stepped aside, letting her enter first. The warmth inside came from a humble clay stove. A blanket hung near the wall, and a wooden table stood beneath dried herbs and smoked meat. The room smelled of cedar and wind-worn earth. She stood stiffly, unsure whether she should sit, speak, or simply wait for whatever fate awaited her. He moved quietly, placing her small bundle of belongings on a chair and pouring water into a clay bowl. Her voice finally broke through the silence, soft but trembling. She asked what he expected from her. He paused, turning his face toward her with calm eyes. His answer was simple. He said he did not buy her to own her. He said he offered the money because no one else stepped forward and the traders would have sent her to worse hands. He said he did not seek a servant or an object, but someone who might share the land with him, even if not by choice at first. His words confused her. She wanted to believe them, but nothing in her past had ever led to kindness without hidden cost. She watched him quietly as he gathered wood for the night fire. He carried himself with a tired strength, the kind that came from years of working long days under the sun. His hair was tied loosely behind his shoulders, and small beads woven into it caught the firelight. She noticed the scars on his hands, signs of labor rather than battle. She wondered if he lived this life alone by choice or by circumstance. Night deepened, and with it came the weight of unspoken expectations. A wedding arranged through trade rarely meant tenderness. Most women in such situations feared what came after the vows, feared the darkness of the wedding night. She braced herself, her breath tight, her pulse quick. She had already suffered enough in life. She expected no mercy now, but instead of asking her to share his bed, he spread out a separate blanket for himself near the fire. He offered her the only bed in the house and said she should rest after a long journey. His voice carried no hunger, no claim, no possession. He treated her not as property, but as a guest. This choice unsettled her more than any forceful demand. She did not understand why a man who traded precious coin would not take what he had paid for. She wondered if there was something wrong with her, or if he saw her as weak and undeserving. She asked him directly why he did not keep her beside him as a husband would. He looked at her slowly, his eyes reflecting the flames, and told her that a marriage forced by money was not a marriage at all. If she stayed, it must be by choice, not obligation. His words landed heavier than chains. No one had ever offered her choice. Freedom felt both terrifying and unreal. She lay awake in the bed while he slept on the floor, curled beneath his poncho with one hand resting near the dying fire. The wind howled outside and the roof creaked softly. She watched him from the shadows, confused by the gentleness of a man who owed her nothing. The world outside saw him as poor, but poverty did not seem to touch his spirit. He owned dignity that no coin could measure. She wasn't sure whether she feared him or trusted him. Before dawn, she rose quietly and stood near the window, watching the sky turn pale above mountains. She wondered if she should run, slip away into the wild and disappear forever. No one would come looking for her. No one ever had. Freedom sat before her like an open path. Yet she hesitated, torn between the safety of walls and the uncertainty of escape. She wondered whether this place might become something more than a bargain, something she never had before. A home. The morning light crept across the floor and touched his sleeping form. He stirred slightly, unaware she watched. She took a slow breath, still torn, knowing that the decision she made at sunrise would change both their lives. The wedding night had passed not with what everyone expected, but with a choice she didn't know she had. And now, with the horizon glowing and her future uncertain, she had to decide whether she would stay. The first rays of morning light washed across the small cabin, turning the rough wooden walls a warm shade of amber. The silence felt heavier than the night before. She stood near the doorway with her shawl wrapped tight, uncertain whether to stay or slip into the wild before he fully woke. Her heart pulled in two directions. One side whispered that running was safer, that trusting anyone had only ever led to pain. The other side told her that maybe this place offered the peace she never had. She watched the man sleep for a long moment, trying to read his intentions in the slow rise and fall of his breath. By the time he stirred awake, she had already stepped outside, leaning against the fence near the goats. The cold morning wind brushed her hair across her face, and she pretended not to notice when he stepped out behind her. He didn't question her or demand anything. Instead, he began feeding the animals, moving with quiet patience. She asked him softly how long he had lived here, and he answered just as simply. He said many seasons had passed on this land, and most of them he lived alone. He said the ground only gave what it wanted, not what he wished. She could hear both pride and exhaustion in his voice. As the sun climbed higher, he fetched tools from the shed and began tending to the farm. She watched him work, noticing how his shoulders strained with each strike of the hoe, how he knelt in the dirt like someone who had long accepted hardship without complaint. She wondered what drove a man to live in such isolation. There were no children's voices, no laughter, no signs of shared life or family traditions. The house carried hints of a past she could not yet see. A broken pottery piece in the corner, a faded cloth hanging on the wall, a small wooden carving tucked behind jars. They looked like memories he chose not to explain. She asked if there had been someone before her. He paused for a moment, then answered indirectly. He said the land had taken much from him, more than it had given. He didn't say who or what, but his silence filled in more than words. She sensed a story buried deep beneath the soil, one he never intended to uncover. Not yet. As the day carried on, she offered to help. He looked surprised, as if he expected her to remain distant or resentful. She insisted, saying she had survived long enough to know how to work for her own food. He handed her a basket and showed her where to gather herbs near the creek. The walk there was quiet. Pine needles softened each step, and the world felt untouched, free from judgment. She moved through the brush with careful steps, collecting what he pointed out. She didn't know the names, but he explained each one. What healed fevers? What cured wounds? What kept wolves away when burned at night? He spoke not like a teacher, but like someone sharing what little he had with someone who might leave at any moment. When they returned, she caught him watching her from the doorway, as if trying to understand why she hadn't run. She pretended she didn't notice. She still wasn't sure herself, that night. He cooked stew over a low flame while she sat near the window, staring at the distant canyon. The scent of herbs filled the room, stirring memories she didn't want to relive. Faces, shouts, deals made in dark rooms by men who owned nothing but claimed everything. She tried to hold her breath until the echoes faded. When he placed a bowl in front of her, she thanked him quietly. They ate in silence, but it wasn't the same silence as before. It felt like two lives sitting beside each other, not colliding, just waiting to see if they could blend. When the dishes were set aside, she asked why he chose to step forward at the trading post. He didn't answer right away. He knelt by the fire, poking at the embers, gathering his words like he was afraid they might land wrong. He said no one should be traded alone. He said he knew the men there and what they planned to do if she hadn't been claimed by someone respectable. He said he didn't see her as a purchase, but as a life pulled into danger. She searched his face, looking for deceit, but found none. Still, she refused to trust easily. She had learned long ago that good intentions often faded when costs became heavy. As night settled again, he prepared his place on the floor like before. She lay in the bed, staring at the ceiling, still uncertain about her place in the house. She felt safer than she expected, yet not safe enough to rest her guard. She wondered if he would eventually ask for what many men demanded in marriage. She wondered if kindness now was only a patient beginning. The next morning brought new questions. She woke before him again, stepping outside to walk beyond the crops. The land stretched wide with no fences past a certain point. A hawk circled overhead, and dry grass swayed like waves in the wind. She felt the strange weight of freedom. She could leave and never look back. Yet something held her there. Not duty, not fear. Something quieter. When she returned, he was saddling his horse. He told her he needed to ride to the trading post for supplies, and she could stay if she wished. His tone carried no warning, no caution against running. It was trust offered freely. That alone unsettled her more than chains would have. She asked him why he wasn't worried she'd disappear. He said if she chose to go, then she never belonged here. With that, he rode off down the trail, leaving her alone on land she barely understood. The hours that followed were filled with restless thoughts. She walked through the cabin, touching objects that hinted at his past. A woven blanket with worn threads. A necklace of polished bone resting beneath a clay jar. A small carved figure shaped like a child, smooth from years of handling. She wondered how long ago laughter filled that home, and what happened to silence it. Her chest tightened. Knowing pain marked this place even before she arrived. She moved outside and tended to the animals, the way she had seen him do. Feeding them gave her purpose, a sense of belonging she never expected. She even repaired a broken fence rail near the goat pen, hands scraped but steady. When she finished, she stood with her arms crossed, staring at the horizon. The land might have been lonely, but it had room for her in ways crowded towns never did. Late in the afternoon, he returned with provisions tied across the saddle. He slowed when he noticed the repaired fence. He didn't thank her with words. His eyes softened instead, carrying a quiet appreciation. He carried the supplies inside and set them by the table. She set plates, sensing a routine forming without being spoken. When night came again, the wind blew colder than before. He rested by the fire, half asleep, but she remained awake, eyes moving across the room. The question grew heavier. Was she staying because she felt safe, or because she feared having nowhere else to go? She pulled the blanket around her shoulders and watched him sleep, unable to name the feeling forming in her chest. The days ahead would either bind their lives or break them apart, and neither knew which path waited. She closed her eyes slowly. Knowing morning would demand answers she still wasn't ready to give, the next days settled into a rhythm. But it was a rhythm stretched over a wire of tension. At dawn he stepped into the fields, his hands in the soil, his eyes on the weak rows of corn and beans. She moved between the cabin and the yard, doing small tasks that slowly became her own. Sweeping the floor, hanging herbs to dry, fetching water from the creek. Neither of them spoke much about what they really feared. They only shared the safe words of chores and weather, yet beneath that quiet, the main conflict kept growing. She had been sold to him as a bride, and everyone at the trading post believed she belonged to him. But inside the cabin, they lived as two strangers under one roof. He still slept by the fire. He still did not claim the right most men would have taken without asking. It was a kindness that confused her, because the rest of the world had never been kind without demanding a price. One afternoon, as she stood in the doorway watching the wind push dust across the yard, he came in with his shirt damp from work and his eyes serious. He told her they needed to ride into town in a few days. Supplies were low, and he needed to trade the last of his dried meat and leather. His voice held something heavier, though, a weight that made her chest tighten. She knew then the quiet life on the farm could not hide them forever from what had happened the night she was sold. She remembered the traders. Men who smelled of whiskey and sweat, who laughed as if human lives were numbers on a ledger. She remembered the way one of them had watched her with a greedy stare when the coins exchanged hands. That look haunted her more than the cold nights she had endured before. If they saw her again with the Apache farmer, they would not forget the bargain. They would test it, challenge it, twist it. That night she lay awake and asked him a question she had been holding back since the first morning. She asked what would happen when people found out he had not truly taken a wife in the way they expected. Would they say he wasted his money? Would they demand proof of their union? Would they see her as his possession to be used or traded again? He stared at the ceiling for a long time before answering. He told her the world beyond their small piece of land did not care about their hearts. It cared about ownership and papers and bargains. He said the men at the post would not understand a marriage built on choice. They would tell him to control her or risk losing her. Some would sharpen their words into weapons. Others might sharpen more than that. He spoke of prejudice against his people, of how settlers and ranchers often treated Apache men as less than human, unworthy of land, unworthy of love, and certainly unworthy of a white wife. His words cut into her. She had lived among settlers all her life. She had heard the stories, savage, heathen, thief. She had believed some of them once, because it was easier than standing against the crowd. Yet here, in this small house, the only savage thing she had seen was the memory of men who sold her like cattle. The Apache farmer had shown her more respect than any of them. The conflict between what the world believed and what she was slowly seeing with her own eyes grew each day. On one side there was fear. On the other, something fragile that she did not dare call hope. When the day came to ride into town, she dressed in the simple dress he had mended for her, the hem still uneven. He saddled the horse and helped her mount, his touch careful, never lingering. They rode together across the scrubland, the trading post rising slowly out of the dust like a bad memory returning. As they approached, she felt the weight of curious eyes already waiting. Men leaned by the corral. Women paused between barrels and crates. Under their stares, her presence beside an Apache man became a spectacle. Some turned away with tight lips. Others watched boldly as if they expected a show. She heard whispers. The woman he bought, poor fool, could have gone to a rancher. They tied the horse and walked inside the store. The trader behind the counter smirked when he saw them. His eyes slid over her like he was revisiting a piece of stock he had once priced. He asked the Apache farmer how his wife was serving him. The question crawled across her skin. She felt stripped and weighed. As if she were on the auction platform again, the farmer's jaw tightened, but he answered calmly. He said she worked hard. He said she was under his protection, not his boot. The trader laughed at that. Protection. He said protection usually cost more than a handful of coins. He wanted to know if the wedding night had been worth it. His tone carried filth that twisted her stomach. She waited for anger to explode from the man beside her, but none came. Instead, he held himself as still as a stone before a storm. He knew how quickly a fight could turn against him in a place like this. One accusation. One lie. One claimed that he had raised his hand first. She could almost hear the noose tightening around his neck. He finished the trade in silence while she stood near the shelves, feeling regrets she could not untangle. If she had run from his farm at dawn that first morning, she might have vanished into the hills, unknown and unseen. Yet something had kept her there. Now that choice placed him under the judgment of men who already hated him. As they left, a rancher stepped in their path. Tall, broad, with a hat pulled low and a smile that never reached his eyes. He spoke her name, the one used when she had first been brought west as a mail-order bride meant for another man. Her blood ran cold. He had been a friend of that man, she remembered now. A friend who had watched her like a wolf watches a lamb? He asked if she liked her new owner. He said if she got tired of dirt and beans, there were richer men with better land and softer beds. He nodded toward the Apache farmer with mock respect and said he could always be paid for his trouble. The offer hung in the air like smoke. The farmer's hand flexed at his side, but he did not reach for his knife. He only said she was not for sale. There was steel in his voice. The rancher's smile thinned. He shrugged and stepped aside, but his eyes burned with a promise. This was not over. On the ride back, the silence between them was thick. She knew her past had just followed her home like a vulture. The sutler, the rancher, the whispers, all of it tied into the main conflict now pressing in on their fragile peace. She had been sold once. There were men already imagining ways to sell her again, and this time they might not use coins. They might use the law. They might use violence. When they reached the cabin, she slid from the horse and walked to the edge of the field, her hands shaking. He followed at a distance, unsure whether to give her space or stand beside her. Finally, she turned and asked him if he regretted stepping forward that night at the post. His answer came slow but firm. He said he never regretted trying to protect someone from harm. What he regretted was the world they had to face now. Days after that trip, strange things began to happen around the farm. Once, they found the fence cut and the goats wandering. Another time, the well bucket had been smashed, splinters scattered across the ground. Tracks of shod horses marked the dirt near the edge of their land. No one needed to say who had done it. The rancher's message was clear. This land, this marriage, this peace, all of it could be taken. Inside the cabin, a different kind of conflict grew between them. Not loud, not cruel, but sharp in its own way. She wanted to help repair the damage, to stand beside him, but guilt pulled her back. She blamed herself for bringing trouble to his doorstep. He blamed himself for putting her in the middle of a fight she never chose. Each of them tried to shoulder the burden alone, and in doing so, pushed the other away. One evening, after patching the fence again, he told her a piece of his past he had never meant to share. Years ago, before the farm was worn and quiet, he had a wife from his own people. A woman who laughed loudly and sang while she worked. They had a small child who loved to chase goats and throw pebbles into the creek. Then one summer, a sickness swept through the camp. The child fell first. His wife followed. The land remained, but all the reasons he had to live on it were buried in shallow graves near the lone cedar. Since then, he had chosen solitude as both punishment and shelter. He did not want another family to lose. He did not want another heart tied to his fragile world. When he saw her at the trading post, alone and afraid, something in him broke and rose at the same time. He could not walk away, even knowing the danger it might bring. She listened quietly, tears burning her eyes. For the first time, she understood that she was not the only one haunted by loss. His silence, his distance, his gentle restraint on their wedding night, it all made a different kind of sense now. He was not only protecting her. He was protecting himself from loving someone he might lose again, but the world did not care about their shared pain. The rancher's threats, the trader's smirks, the tracks near their boundary, all of it tightened like a rope around their small homestead. The main conflict now had 3 sharp points. Her past that would not let go. The prejudice and greed of men who wanted to control what they did not own. And the quiet fear between husband and wife who were not yet truly husband and wife, afraid to step closer, afraid to step apart. As the sun sank behind the hills one evening, the sky turned the color of embers. She stood beside the field, watching shadows lengthen when she saw a dust cloud moving along the distant trail. More than one rider. More than one horse. Her stomach dropped. She called his name, and he came to stand beside her, squinting into the fading light. Riders were coming straight toward their land, silhouettes dark against the bleeding sky. Neither of them knew if they brought law, trouble, or a final cruel offer. All they knew was that the fragile peace of their strange wedding was about to be tested in a way neither of them could avoid. The silhouettes on the horizon moved slowly at first, as if the riders were simply passing through. Gust trailed behind them in a long pale ribbon, catching the last streaks of fading sunlight. She stood beside the Apache farmer, her hand unconsciously clutching the fence post, knuckles tight. Neither of them spoke as they watched the figures draw nearer. A quiet fear crept through her chest, the kind that felt both familiar and new. She had spent most of her life surviving each moment as it came, but this time it wasn't her life alone at stake. Someone else could be hurt because of her past, and that weighed heavier than any danger she had faced before. The riders slowed as they reached the border of the property, their horses restless, hooves shifting in the dry dirt. The man in front wore a dark hat and had shoulders broad enough to suggest he was used to taking rather than asking. She recognized him from the trading post, the rancher who made the offer. He sat tall, letting the moment stretch just long enough to look like he owned the land beneath them. He called out to the farmer, using his name like it tasted sour. He said he came with an offer to settle unfinished business. He said he didn't want trouble, only fairness. The farmer stepped forward with calm eyes, no weapon in hand, though tension rolled through his shoulders. He replied that they had nothing to settle. The rancher smiled, slow and bitter. He said a woman purchased at a trading post had no say in where she stayed, and the man who paid for her did not own her yet. Not until the union was consummated, as he twisted the word with his voice. She felt her chest burn with shame and fury. She wanted to shout at him, to tell him she was not something to be claimed or stamped like cattle. But the farmer raised a hand gently, holding her back, not to silence her, but to shield her from a fight she wasn't ready for, the rancher continued. He said he was willing to pay more, twice what the farmer paid, maybe 3 times. Enough silver to hire help for the farm, enough supplies to last a long winter. He made the offer like he was giving a gift, like he expected a handshake in return. The farmer didn't flinch. He told the rancher she was not an object to be sold. The rancher laughed, loud enough for the other riders to echo it. He said that was not how the world worked out here. He said a man with pride but no power was just a dreamer waiting to be crushed. When it became clear they weren't getting what they wanted, the rancher leaned forward, eyes narrowing. He warned the farmer that ownership was not just a matter of money but of proof. He said the law might ask why an Apache man had taken a white woman without witnesses of a real marriage. He said judges in town might want to protect her from a life in the wilderness. He said hands in the saloon might vote differently if paid a drink or two. He spoke of the world like a knife, cutting wherever it pleased. The riders eventually turned their horses and left, the dust rising behind them like ghosts lingering in the air. But their message stayed heavy. They would return. They would press harder. This was not an argument. It was the beginning of a siege. That night, the wind rattled the roof and carried strange sounds across the fields. She couldn't sleep. She sat by the fire where he usually rested, knees pulled to her chest. The flames flickered low, shadows crawling up the walls like restless spirits. The farmer sat across from her, sharpening a knife not for hunting, but for something heavier. His eyes were distant, his jaw rigid, as if preparing for a storm he had hoped to never see. She whispered that she would leave if it meant keeping him safe. He stopped sharpening, looked up slowly, and shook his head. He told her she had nowhere to run where men like those riders wouldn't follow. And he said he did not take her into his home only to abandon her when danger knocked. His voice shook slightly, like something inside him was fighting itself. She asked why he cared so much for someone who might bring death to his doorstep. He answered that helping her had never been a mistake. Maybe the pain he carried from his past made him afraid of losing another family. Maybe her presence reopened wounds he thought were buried. But he said running from life was not the same as protecting it. Days passed, each one adding weight. The livestock grew restless at night. Twice they found boot prints near the field where none should be. Someone shot an arrow into the fence post, not close enough to hit, but close enough to speak. It wasn't Apache style. It was meant to frame him. Rumors spread at town. She heard whispers from passing travelers. People were questioning their marriage, questioning whether she needed to be rescued. The rancher wasn't just threatening them. He was poisoning the world around them. Meanwhile, something shifted quietly inside the cabin. She and the farmer moved around each other with a closeness that came not from romance, but from shared survival. When he returned from the field with sore shoulders, she silently handed him a warm cloth and rubbed his hands without being asked. When she cried quietly at night, he sat by the fire and stayed awake until her breathing steadied. They didn't speak the feelings forming between them, but the silence between them began to feel warmer, not colder, still. Neither dared reach across the final line that separated them. Not while the world still believed she was property. Not while danger watched. One afternoon, as clouds rolled overhead, she hiked toward the stream with an empty bucket. The air smelled of rain and unsettled memories. Halfway there, she heard hoofbeats. She froze and ducked behind a rock. 3 men on horseback rode through the brush, talking in low voices. They weren't ranchers she recognized. They weren't townsfolk either. They looked like hired hands. Men paid to do the work that wealthy men didn't want their names attached to. They spoke of grabbing her when she was alone, taking her back to town, claiming she was saved from capture. They even discussed staging a fight, blaming the farmer, making it look like he had held her against her will. Her blood ran cold. She waited until they rode off, then rushed back to the cabin, breath ragged. When she reached him, she tried to speak, but her voice broke. He steadied her shoulders and listened. As she described what she heard, something in him changed. A decision settled across his face like a shadow. He said they had been waiting, hoping trouble would pass. Now it was chasing them. He said they needed help, allies, people who would defend truth instead of fear. For the first time, he told her about another settlement beyond the ridge, people of his band still living near the canyon river. He had stayed away from them since losing his family, not wanting to carry grief into their camp. But now he said they must go. Alone, they would be hunted. Together, they might withstand what was coming. She nodded, but fear shook her again. The rancher's men would not let them leave quietly. If they saw her riding alongside the Apache farmer toward tribal land, rumors would turn into accusations. The danger would reach beyond the farm and into the canyon. Still, they began packing food, blankets, tools, anything they could carry. The sky darkened, the wind rising into a storm. Moments before they mounted the horse, hoofbeats thundered from the trail. More than before, faster, rougher. She stepped back, heart hammering. He pulled her behind him, hand gripping the reins tight, through the curtain of dust. Riders came charging toward their land again, this time not just watching. This time they were ready to act. Lightning cracked across the sky, splitting the darkness as the horses drew near. The world narrowed to the moment before impact. She clutched his arm. He steadied himself, not with hatred but with resolve. The life they had been building, fragile and uncertain, now stood on the edge of violence and truth. Everything was about to break open. The storm rolled across the land. As the riders closed in, thunder roaring above like the sky itself was warning them to turn back. The hooves pounded through mud and dry grass, coming fast enough to shake the ground beneath their feet. The farmer stepped in front of her, shielding her with his body, but she grabbed his arm, refusing to be treated like someone who needed hiding. She had spent too much of her life being dragged, traded, silenced. This time she would stand beside him. The riders pulled their horses to a halt a few yards away. The rancher who led them looked down from his saddle, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. He called the farmer a thief. He called her a lost woman in need of proper guardians. He claimed that she had been taken against her will and that he and his men were here to escort her safely back to town. His lie was smooth and practiced, meant for an audience that had already made up its mind. The farmer raised his voice over the wind, telling them she was there by choice, but the rancher scoffed, accusing him of forcing her to say it. He reached down to grab her from his horse. As if the decision belonged to him, she stepped forward before the farmer could speak. Her voice cracked but carried enough strength to silence the storm for a moment. She said she was done being spoken for. She said she had been sold and traded and pushed from one man to another, and none of it had ever brought her safety or dignity. She said she chose the farmer not because of ownership, but because he was the only man who ever treated her as a person instead of a bargain. The rancher's smug expression faltered, but he called her confused. He said the law would never let her stay on Apache land. She took another step toward the rain, refusing to back down. She told him the law had failed her long before she ever met the farmer, and she would rather face the unknown than return to men who believed she belonged to them. The rancher raised his hand, signaling his men to advance, but before anyone moved, more riders appeared beyond the ridge, galloping fast toward the farm. Their horses bore painted markings and woven saddlecloths. These were not ranch hands. These were Apache warriors, summoned by the farmer's call for help. The storm winds whipped feathers and braids as the warriors spread out, forming a line of silent warning. Their presence shifted everything. The rancher's men faltered. Their confidence came from numbers and power, not conviction. Now the land itself seemed to stand against them. The Apache leader, an older woman with braided hair wrapped in leather ties, rode forward and stopped between the two groups. Her gaze carried years of wisdom and sorrow, and when she spoke, her voice spread across the field like the first calm after thunder. She said no woman should be taken from her home by force. She said the farmer's land, though small, was protected so long as he stood in truth. And she said anyone who drew weapons would be held accountable, not just by one man, but by all who stood behind him. The rancher realized then he had pushed too far. He glanced around, seeing that none of his hired men wanted to shed blood over a deal gone bitter. He pulled his reins sharply, frustration etched across his face. He muttered that she would regret her choice. He warned the farmer that peace would not last forever. But he turned his horse and rode away, his men following like shadows, slipping back into the storm. The moment the dust settled, the rain softened to a gentle drizzle. The warriors dismounted to speak with the farmer. The older woman embraced him with quiet grief, seeing the pain he carried for those he lost. She told him healing did not come from solitude, but from letting others carry the weight beside him. She then turned to the woman he had rescued and bowed her head respectfully, acknowledging her choice without judgment. Together they returned to the cabin where the fire still flickered. The warriors offered to stay through the night, forming a silent ring of protection. For the first time, she slept without fear. In the days that followed, the land seemed to breathe again. The fences stayed intact. The well remained untouched. The rancher no longer appeared on the trail. Word must have spread that the farm was no longer isolated prey. Travelers who passed through spoke differently now, curious rather than cruel. Some whispered that the farmer had found a wife from the east. Others said she was a woman who had chosen a new life with honor rather than hunger. Slowly, the story that had once marked her as property began to turn into something else. A woman who found purpose not through ownership, but through partnership. With peace returning, she and the farmer began to speak openly about the things left unspoken. One morning, he led her to the cedar tree where two small graves rested under the soil. He placed his hand over the stones, voice unsteady, confessing that he had feared loving again because he could not carry another loss. She knelt beside him, resting her head against his shoulder, telling him she was not here to replace what he lost, but to walk beside it. Their bond did not need to erase the past to become their future. As winter approached, they chose to marry again. Not by trade or transaction, but by promise. They invited his people from the canyon camp and a small group of settlers who had seen the truth instead of rumors. The ceremony took place near the creek where they once gathered herbs together, the water whispering behind them like a blessing. She wore a dress stitched from cotton and buckskin, carrying both worlds in a single seam. He wore beads carved by his own hands. When they spoke their vows, no one questioned whether the union was real. It was stamped not by law or witnesses alone, but by choice, The farm slowly transformed from a place shaped by loss into a place shaped by hope. She planted a garden near the window so the cabin would always smell of herbs and wildflowers. He built a new fence around the grove, not to shut the world out, but to protect what they were growing together. Travelers began stopping by the homestead for shelter or trade, and she welcomed them with warm food while he helped repair their wagons. People no longer saw them as outcasts living on lonely soil. They saw them as caretakers of a small piece of the West where peace had been fought for and earned. In spring, she felt a new life stirring inside her. The baby she carried became a bridge between past and future, between sorrow and hope. The farmer stood beside her, hand resting on her belly, eyes filled with a quiet joy he once believed he would never feel again. He whispered that the land finally had a reason to grow. She whispered that she finally had a place to belong. Their story traveled across the frontier, not as a tale of a woman sold to an Apache farmer, but as a story of second chances, of courage, of a marriage chosen rather than claimed. People who heard it spoke not of ownership, but of love found in the most unlikely soil. And when riders passed their land now, they did not stare with judgment. They tipped their hats with respect, knowing the home they rode past had been built by more than wood and labor. It had been built by hearts that refused to break. As the sun set beyond the canyon one evening, the farmer wrapped his arm around her shoulders while she rested her head against him, listening to distant coyotes and the rustle of spring wind. The past no longer controlled their future. The land no longer felt empty. The journey that began with fear and uncertainty had ended with peace, a shared life and a bond strong enough to weather whatever came next, and with that, the farm that once belonged to a lonely man became a home for a family, a place where love grew from the soil just as surely as the crops that finally began to rise green and tall beneath the open sky.